Welcome to Crime Time Inc. My name is Alex, and I'm your Crime Time Inc. host today. I have to warn you that the next two episodes contain explicit and detailed descriptions of extreme violence. The content includes graphic accounts of homicide, assault, and other disturbing criminal acts. This material is presented for historical accuracy and educational purposes only, not for sensationalism. These descriptions may be extremely upsetting and potentially triggering for many listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you are sensitive to accounts of violence or are listening in the presence of children or others who may be adversely affected, we recommend skipping these episodes, or I will warn you by saying graphic content warning prior to the description of the crimes. The historical significance of these crimes and their impact on American culture necessitates a complete accounting of events, but we understand if listeners need to engage with this material at their own pace or avoid certain sections entirely. The content you are about to hear is taken from testimony, statements, and interviews of the perpetrators of the crimes and witnesses and have been checked and cross-referenced for accuracy. Some testimonies vary slightly on some minor details. August 8, 1969. If you had opened the Los Angeles Times on that Friday morning in August, nothing would have suggested the impending horror. The front page carried stories that reflected the routine rhythm of American life: a wounded police officer who couldn't be saved at Central Receiving Hospital, legislative debates over school budgets, and scientists speculating about the possibility of life on Mars. An ocean away in London, 4 young men were photographed walking across a street outside their recording studio. The Beatles, creating what would become the iconic Abbey Road album cover, blissfully unaware that their music would soon be twisted into a murderous philosophy by a failed musician turned cult leader. The #1 record in the UK hit parade was Honky Tonk Women by the Rolling Stones. That evening, millions of Americans tuned their television sets to watch Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News as he led with a story about the devaluation of the French franc, economic news that seemed important at the time but would soon be overshadowed by events that would shake the nation's sense of security. America in August 1969 was experiencing a unique cultural moment, poised between technological triumph and social anxiety. Just 3 weeks earlier, Neil Armstrong had taken humanity's first steps on the lunar surface. The seemingly impossible had been achieved. The space race wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a demonstration of what human ingenuity could accomplish. Yet alongside this optimism ran a current of unease about where technology and society were heading. In a remarkable coincidence that would later seem prophetic, the #1 song on the charts in the USA that very day was "In the Year 2525," Zager and Evans's haunting vision of a dystopian future, a melody that questioned whether humanity was truly on the right path. The song's lyrics, with their warnings about a future where truth and free will might be chemically controlled, reflected deeper anxieties bubbling beneath the surface of American optimism. What no one could have known was how prescient these concerns about manipulation and lost innocence would seem in just 24 hours. On this ordinary Friday, Americans went about their business. They drove to work, shopped for groceries, made weekend plans. A beautiful actress in her 8th month of pregnancy prepared to spend a quiet evening with friends. Elsewhere in Los Angeles, a small group of young people, isolated at an old movie ranch, received instructions from their charismatic leader. These separate worlds, the mundane normalcy of American life and the isolated cult preparing to unleash violence, were about to collide in a way that would permanently alter our cultural narrative. As dawn broke over Los Angeles County, the members of Charles Manson's family awoke at Spahn Ranch. The day began like many others, with the group's women preparing breakfast and tending to chores around the dusty property. Charles Manson spent the morning playing guitar and conversing with various family members. Among those present were Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. According to later testimony, There was no immediate indication that this day would be different from any other. The family's daily routines continued, with members caring for the horses, preparing food, and engaging in conversations heavy with Manson's apocalyptic philosophy about an impending race war he called HelterSkelter. Approximately 20 miles away, in the peaceful Benedict Canyon area of Los Angeles, the day began quietly at 11050 Cielo Drive. Sharon Tate, the 26-year-old actress best known for Valley of the Dolls and 8.5 months pregnant, was staying at the secluded residence while her husband, director Roman Polanski, was in London working on a film project. Sharon had breakfast that morning with her house guests. Her close friend and former lover, Jay Sebring, a prominent Hollywood hairstylist, and Wojciech Frykowski and his girlfriend Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune. The group had been keeping Sharon company during Polanski's absence. According to Winifred Chapman, the housekeeper who arrived around 8 a.m., it was a relaxed morning. Sharon spoke by telephone with her husband in London, discussing his upcoming return. Chapman completed her usual household duties before leaving the property around 4:30 p.m. By midday, the various individuals were engaged in separate activities across Los Angeles. Sharon Tate had a lunch appointment with friends at a Beverly Hills restaurant. Despite her advanced pregnancy, friends later remembered her as being in good spirits, excited about the impending birth of her son. Abigail Folger went shopping at a Beverly Hills boutique and stopped at a bookstore, purchasing several books. Wojciech Frykowski ran errands in the city. Jay Sebring tended to clients at his salon, including a late afternoon appointment. Back at Spahn Ranch, tensions were reportedly building. According to later testimony, Manson gathered several family members during the afternoon. While no definitive record exists of exactly what was said, multiple sources indicate that discussions about targeting the rich piggies and implementing HelterSkelter intensified. Charles "Tex" Watson spent part of the afternoon working on a car at the ranch, while Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel stayed close to Manson. Linda Kasabian, who had only been with the family for a few weeks, was caring for her young daughter. Around 6:30 p.m., Sharon Tate and her friends gathered back at the Cielo Drive house. Sharon had invited additional friends for dinner at El Coyote, a Mexican restaurant on Beverly Boulevard. At approximately 7 p.m., Sharon, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski left Cielo Drive for El Coyote. The group enjoyed a leisurely meal before returning to the house around 9 p.m. According to the restaurant staff who later spoke to police, there was nothing unusual about their demeanor. They were simply friends enjoying an evening together. Upon returning to Cielo Drive, they changed into more comfortable clothes for a quiet night at home. Folger retired to her bedroom to read one of her newly purchased books, while Frykowski dozed on the living room couch. Sharon and Jay reportedly sat in her bedroom, talking about the baby and plans for the future. 18-year-old Steve Parent had recently graduated high school with plans to attend junior college that fall. Ambitious and hardworking, he juggled 2 jobs to earn tuition money, working full-time at a plumbing company making deliveries while picking up evening shifts as a salesman at a stereo shop. Weeks earlier, Parent had offered a ride to William Garrettson, who was hitchhiking. After driving him to the Cielo Drive property, Garrettson expressed his gratitude and extended an open invitation to visit him at the guest house where he lived. This casual invitation gave Parent the impression that Garrettson might have significant financial means. On Friday, August 8th, Parent was looking to sell his AM/FM clock radio for extra school money. Remembering the seemingly well-off guy he'd given a ride to, Parent decided to drive his parents' white Rambler to Cielo Drive. His plan was straightforward: see if Garrettson might be interested in an impulse purchase, something Parent was familiar with from his experience in stereo sales. The impromptu sales call seemed worth the drive. Even if unsuccessful, Parent could still salvage the evening by meeting up with friends. It was just another Friday night hustle for a young man with aspirations, unaware that this ordinary decision would place him at the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. When the sun set on August 8, 1969, America was still clinging to the fading innocence of the 1960s, the hope, the idealism, the belief that love could conquer all. By the time dawn broke on August 9th, that innocence would begin an irreversible unraveling. Charles Manson instilled two fundamental beliefs in his followers: absolute obedience to him and the conviction that they were the most special people on earth. These teachings took deep root, particularly his philosophy that all things were the same: love and hate, sanctity and sin, life and death. The family, Manson promised, would rule a post-apocalyptic world after HelterSkelter, ordained by both the Beatles and the Bible through Charlie's interpretation. Manson began setting events in motion that would shock the nation. The family had been discussing copycat killings to free Bobby Beausoleil, who was in jail for the murder of Gary Hinman. This plan aligned perfectly with Manson's larger vision. If the victims were famous enough, perhaps it would finally spark the racial clash he'd been prophesying. Manson was a master manipulator, making rapid-fire decisions that demonstrated his dazzling command of both individual psychology and group dynamics. He needed someone to lead this mission, and that someone was Tex Watson. Let's find out more about Tex Watson after this quick break. Watson had the necessary attributes: physically imposing, a former high school athlete still in decent shape despite heavy drug use, and desperately seeking importance within the family. Most crucially, he owed Manson. Charlie reminded Tex how he'd once botched a drug deal that put the entire family in jeopardy, how Bobby had made a sacrifice by killing Gary Hinman to protect them all. The subtle implication was clear. Wasn't Tex obligated to reciprocate? High on LSD and methadone, Tex agreed to lead the mission. It was his right, he believed. But who would die? Manson guided the conversation masterfully, suggesting that these victims needed to be important, celebrities whose deaths would command headlines. Without explicitly ordering anything, he wondered if Tex might be thinking about that place where Terry Melcher used to live, the house on Cielo Drive. Charlie provided detailed instructions: bring rope, knives, bolt cutters for the phone lines, and wear dark clothes. He warned about the electronic gate and suggested climbing the fence instead. The .22 buntline revolver was for last resort only. Manson manipulated the situation so perfectly that later, when Tex claimed Charlie ordered the murders and Charlie insisted they were Tex's idea, both were telling a version of the truth. Next, Manson needed to select the women who would accompany Tex. Each was chosen for specific reasons. Susan Atkins, who had been with Beausoleil at Hinman's house and knew what had been written on the walls; Patricia Krenwinkel, whose shyness masked a cold, unfeeling nature; and Linda Kasabian, who had a valid driver's license. Charlie instructed each woman separately to dress in dark clothes, bring a change of outfit and a knife, and obey Tex's every command. Meanwhile, Stephen Parent had driven to Cielo Drive that evening with no knowledge of what was coming. Around 11:45 p.m., Parent arrived at the Cielo property, opening the electronic gate and driving his white Rambler up the long driveway. Garrettson wasn't interested in buying the radio, but offered Parent a beer. They chatted while Parent demonstrated the radio's features. At 12:15 a.m., after calling a friend who needed help setting up a stereo system, Parent prepared to leave. At the same time, Tex and the three women were on their way to Cielo Drive. Tex took ranch hand Johnny Swartz's yellow 1959 Ford, with Linda in the passenger seat and Susan and Patricia in the back. As they were leaving, Charlie called out to Susan, "Do something witchy," a reference to the political piggy message written in blood at the Hinman murder scene. During the drive, the women weren't entirely sure what they were doing, perhaps just another creepy crawl mission to steal things from homes. Tex got lost, taking wrong turns through Beverly Hills before finding his way onto Sunset Boulevard toward Benedict Canyon. As the clock approached midnight on August 8, 1969, the fates of several people on Cielo Drive were about to collide in the most horrific way. Tex Watson was guiding the Ford up the steep, winding Cielo Drive, passing scattered houses along the narrow road. The tight curves and possibility of deer venturing onto the road after dark made the drive particularly challenging. When they reached the top of the hill, Tex stopped in front of the closed electronic gate and instructed the women to wait. Following Manson's instructions, Tex grabbed bolt cutters, climbed a telephone pole, and snipped the wires connecting to the main house and guest cottage. He then backed the car down the hill, a tricky maneuver on the narrow road, and led the women back up on foot. The .22 revolver was tucked into his pants, a coil of 3-ply white rope slung over his shoulder. Garretson walked Parent out to his Rambler. As they said goodbye, Altabelli's dog began barking what Garretson called its people bark, indicating humans were walking around the property. Neither man was alarmed. Someone was probably just leaving the main house. Garretson headed back inside while Parent got into his car. Tex whispered instructions for the women to follow him over the fence. There was an incline on the right side of the road, making the climb relatively easy. Once inside the property, Tex matter-of-factly announced they were going to kill everyone in the house. The women didn't recoil from this news. As Patricia Krenwinkel would later recall, we were little kitty cats who were mentally gone. They had been commanded to obey Tex, and they would. Parent began slowly moving his Rambler down the long, curving driveway toward the main gate. When he reached the closed gate, he stopped and rolled down his window to push the button that would open it. Graphic content warning. Hearing the car approach, Tex hissed at the women to jump into the bushes and lie down. He pulled out the .22 with his right hand and gripped a knife with his left. When Parent saw Tex emerge from the shadows, he pleaded, "Please, please don't hurt me. I'm your friend. I won't tell," raising his arm to protect himself. Watson slashed his left hand with the knife, slicing through the strap of his wristwatch. Then, ignoring Charlie's instructions only to use the gun as a last resort, he shot Parent 4 times, in his arm, his left cheek, and twice in the chest. Parent died instantly, his blood beginning to pool in the car. 100 yards away, Mrs. Seymour Cott was awakened by what sounded like 3 or 4 gunshots, but heard nothing more and went back to sleep. A private security patrol officer also thought he heard shots, but couldn't determine their direction. He called the West Los Angeles division of the LAPD, where the officer who took the call remarked, "I hope we don't have a murder," but didn't send anyone to investigate. After a moment's reflection on how the muzzle flashes had reflected off Parent's glasses, Tex reached inside the open window, shifted the Rambler into neutral, and pushed it back down the driveway. He then whispered for the women to come out of the bushes. As they made their way down the curved driveway, they could see the main house and Christmas lights sparkling on the fence outside. Inside the main house, no one had heard the gunshots. The canyon's peculiar acoustics had swallowed the sound. Abigail Folger was reading a book in the guest bedroom. Wojtek Frykowski was asleep on the living room couch. In the master bedroom, Sharon, Tate, and Jay Sebring were talking quietly on the bed. Folger wore a white nightgown, while Tate was in her underwear with a negligee draped over her shoulders due to the hot weather. Both men were fully clothed. In the guest cottage, Garretson also hadn't heard the gunfire. He put on some music, watched TV, and began writing letters. When he tried to make a phone call, a line Parent had just used minutes earlier, he found it dead. The stage was now set for what would become one of the most gruesome murder scenes in American history. As the 4 family members approached the main house on Cielo Drive, Tex Watson instructed Linda Kasabian to check for unlocked entrances. Though she claimed everything was secured, this wasn't true. Several windows remained partially open. Tex cut through a screen by the front door, climbed through the window, and signaled for Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel to follow, while Linda stood guard. Inside, they discovered Wojtek Frykowski asleep on the couch. When Frykowski stirred and asked who they were, Tex kicked him in the head and replied chillingly, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." Frykowski started to say something else, but Tex cut him off. "Another word and you're dead." Tex asked him where his money was. He nodded toward a desk, Susan was sent to search the house, where she found Abigail Folger reading in the guest bedroom. Abigail Folger glanced up from her book and smiled. She wasn't shocked to see a stranger in the house. Tate and Polanski regularly welcomed all hours guests. This woman seemed like just one more. Susan smiled and gave a little finger wave. Folger waved back and resumed reading. Further down the hall, Susan peered into the main bedroom and saw Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring talking. They apparently were in deep conversation. Neither noticed her. Susan made her way back to the living room, passing Folger's room again, waving to her for a second time. When she rejoined Tex, she quietly told him that there were 3 other people inside. Tex told her to bring them to him. Susan went first to the guest bedroom, where she brandished her knife at Folger and ordered her to go into the living room. Pat held her there at knife point while Susan went to the main bedroom for Tate and Sebring. She told them, "Come with me. Don't say a word or you're dead." They meekly got up from the bed and walked ahead of her down the hall. When they reached the living room, Tate could see Tex and Pat waiting there. She hesitated, and Tex roughly grasped her arm and dragged her forward. Frykowski reeled on the couch, still stunned from being kicked in the head. Tex had the 3-ply rope, but he told Susan to tie Frykowski's hands behind him with a towel. She had trouble knotting the thick towel, but did the best that she could. Tex used the rope to tie Sebring's hands. Sebring complained that Tex was being too rough, and Tex warned him, "One more word and you're dead." Frykowski gasped, "He means it." Tex looped more rope around Sebring's neck and then flipped the other end up over a beam in the ceiling. Tex then tied the rope around Tate's neck. Tate began crying, and Tex snarled at her to shut up. Sebring protested, "Can't you see that she's pregnant?" "I told you, one more word and you're dead." Tex screamed and shot him in the abdomen. Sebring collapsed on the living room rug. Sharon became hysterical, but Abigail Folger seemed anxious to cooperate, as if somehow she could bring sanity into the madness simply by maintaining her own control. Tex looked around the living room and announced, "I want all the money you've got here." Folger said that she had money in her room. Susan marched her there, and Folger removed some bills from her pocketbook. Susan gave Tex the money. It was about $70. Disgusted, Tex said, "You mean that's all you've got?" "How much do you want?" Frykowski asked. "We want thousands," Tex said. Tate said that they didn't have any money in the house, but if they had time, they could get some. Tex thought she might be stalling, hopeful that help was somehow on the way. He said, "You know I'm not kidding." And Tate said that she knew. Tex was furious. Charlie told him to bring back money. They'd come to this house because rich people lived there, and now Tate was telling him that they didn't have any. Jay Sebring groaned as he lay on the floor. Tex leaned over him and started to stab him, slamming the knife into Sebring again and again until Tex was sure he was dead before standing up and kicking him in the head. Tate and Folger screamed during the entire episode. When Tex was finally finished and stood up, his knife dripping blood, one of the women asked, "What are you going to do with us?" Although it was obvious. Tex's reply was blunt. "You're all going to die." Folger and Tate began begging for their lives. Ever since Tex had kicked him into semi-consciousness, Wojtek Frykowski had slumped on the couch. But upon hearing about his impending death sentence, he suddenly jerked upright and began tugging his hands free from the towel Susan had clumsily knotted around his wrists. Tex yelled to Susan, "Kill him!" And she tried, but Frykowski got his hands loose and grappled with her, the two of them rolling around on the floor, Frykowski wrapping his hands in Susan's long hair and Susan blindly stabbing with her knife, sinking the blade mostly into Frykowski's legs. He screamed as he struggled. At some point, Susan lost her knife. Out near the gate, Linda heard Frykowski's screams clearly. Instinctively, she began walking back toward the main house, stopping just outside. While Pat held Folger at knife point and Tate watched helplessly, Tex tried to help Susan finish off Frykowski. He fired a couple shots into him and battered at his head with the handle of the bunt line so hard the right grip of the gun shattered and Frykowski's skull cracked. Frykowski still managed to struggle to his feet and stumble out onto the lawn, with Tex not far behind. Frykowski fell down and Tex jumped on him, repeatedly stabbing until he was still. Just steps away, Linda looked on in horror. She was close enough to the living room to see Susan, and she shouted, "Please make it stop! People are coming!" A lie, but the only thing she could think of. Susan said that there was nothing she could do. Linda ran back down the driveway, climbed over the fence, and stopped down the hill where Tex had parked the yellow '59 Ford. Back at the main house, Folger broke away. She was halfway across the front lawn, her nightgown flowing behind her like an apparition, when Krenwinkel caught up to her and brought her knife down, stabbing her 28 times. Tex, certain that he'd finished off Frykowski, was standing nearby. Pat called him over and said she wasn't sure whether or not Folger was dead. Tex said he would make sure. Meanwhile, Pat was to go to the back house. He pointed in the direction of the guest cottage and kill whoever was there. Pat was shaking, equally afraid to follow Tex's order and to disobey. She compromised by walking down the back alley between the main house and guest cottage until she was out of Tex's sight. Then she waited for a few moments and returned. She told Tex that she had looked in a window and there was no one in the back house. He believed her, a lucky escape for William Garretson, who was playing music and totally oblivious to the nightmare unfolding only yards away. Tex had stabbed Folger several more times. He wrote later that she was in fact alive when he reached her, and that she moaned, "I give up, you've got me," just before he delivered the fatal blow. Drenched in blood and their own sweat, the two killers rose to see Frykowski, yet again on his feet, stumbling toward them. Soon they were stabbing him with the same mechanical precision, forcing steel through flesh, bone, and cartilage. The coroner later tallied 51 stab wounds, plus 13 blows to the head and 2 bullet wounds. Atkins had remained in the house with Tate, who was whimpering, sitting on the floor, still in only lingerie and still bound by the neck to the dead body of her former lover, Sebring. She was the only one still alive. She was due to give birth to the child, a boy, in 2 weeks. Watson came back inside and ordered Atkins to kill her. Tate begged her to spare her life, to spare her unborn child. "I want to have my baby," she said. "Woman, I have no mercy for you," Atkins responded, locking her arm around Tate's neck from behind. "You're going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." She stabbed her in the stomach. Watson joined in. The pair stabbed her 16 times until she cried out for her mother and died. It should be noted that Susan Atkins admitted and even boasted about stabbing Sharon Tate, but later denied that she had done any of the stabbing, and it was all done by Tex Watson. Tex Watson also says it was he and not Susan Atkins who stabbed Sharon Tate. It is difficult to know who to believe. Atkins dipped her fingers into one of Tate's wounds and tasted her blood. It was warm, sticky, and nice, she'd recall later. When it was over, Tex and Susan and Pat surveyed the scene. Was it sufficiently gruesome? The nylon rope was knotted around Sebring's and Tate's necks, looped up over the ceiling beam between them. Out on the lawn, Frykowski's face was mutilated almost beyond recognition, and Folger's once white nightgown was saturated with gore. They felt that ought to be enough. Tex thought they'd been careful not to leave fingerprints or any other clues. He took Folger's $70 and prepared to lead Susan and Pat out of the house. There were other valuables there for the taking. Sebring wore an expensive watch, and there was a little cash by the side of Tate's bed. But in the aftermath of slaughter, they wanted to leave. Just before they did, Tex remembered that Charlie told them to write something witchy in blood, something that would appear to be proof that the people who'd killed Gary Hinman were still at large. Tex told Susan to do it. She didn't want to use her bare hand, so she dipped a towel in Tate's blood and carefully wrote "pig" on the outside of the front door. Tex, Susan, and Pat were all dripping with blood. Their clothes were bloody, and Tex had some on his hands. He got careless on the way out. Not feeling like scaling the fence again, he pressed the button to open the gate with his index finger, leaving a bloodied fingerprint on the button. The three of them walked through the Cielo gate and down the hill to the yellow Ford where Linda waited. We'll find out what happened next after this quick break. There had been little conversation in the car as the four drove to Cielo, but on the way back to Spahn, everyone talked at once. Susan told Tex that she'd lost her knife back at the house, and he shouted angrily at her. Pat complained that her hand ached while stabbing Folger. Her knife frequently struck bone, and the impact hurt her hand. All of them were angry with Linda for fleeing the scene. After a few minutes, Tex steered off Benedict Canyon Drive onto Portola Drive, a residential side street. He parked close to a house at 9870 where a hose stretched out into the yard. Tex turned on the water tap, and he, Susan, and Pat clustered around the hose, splashing water on their hands and faces to rinse away splatters of blood. It was about 1 a.m. They tried to be quiet, but the running water and their hushed chatter roused Rudolph Weber, who hurried outside to see who was in his yard at such a late hour. Tex explained that they were out walking and wanted a drink, but the parked Ford was right behind him and Weber didn't believe it. As Weber walked towards them, Tex, Susan, and Pat jumped back in the car. Weber tried to reach in through the open driver's side window to rip the key from the ignition, but Tex was too quick. The car sped away, but not before Weber noted its license number, GYY 435. On the way back to Spahn Ranch, Tex changed out of his bloody clothes and into fresh ones, while Linda held the wheel. Susan and Pat removed their bloody garments too and put on the clean clothes they'd brought with them. Linda rolled all the discarded clothes into a bundle and, on Tex's order, tossed them out of the car on Benedict Canyon Drive and down the steep slope by the side of the road. They turned left onto Mulholland Drive and then right onto Beverly Glen Boulevard. Linda threw out the knives one by one, and then Tex, using his left hand while holding the steering wheel with his right hand, threw out the .22 bunt line over the car and down a steep ravine. Shortly after that, they stopped for gas. They paid for it out of the $70 they stole from Abigail Folger and took turns going into the restrooms to check for blood spots. Linda drove the rest of the way home. Charlie was waiting for them on the boardwalk of the old movie set, dancing around naked in the moonlight with Nancy Pittman, a.k.a. Brenda McCann. His first words were, "What are you doing home so early?" Tex told him what had happened. It had been messy, like he wanted. Lots of panic. Everybody dead. Susan Atkins told him Tex's line about the devil, and he grinned. He seemed pleased. When he asked why they didn't go to any other houses, they just shrugged. Then he looked each of them in the eye solemnly. "Do you have any remorse?" he demanded. "No," they each replied. Susan said she saw a spot of blood on the outside of the car when we were at the gas station. Charlie told them to go into the kitchen, get a sponge, and wipe any blood off. And he also instructed Pat and Linda to go all through the car and wipe off the blood spots. "Okay," he said gently. "Go to sleep and don't tell anyone." As the girls wandered off, he called Tex back. "Was it really HelterSkelter?" he asked. Tex replied, "Yeah, it sure was HelterSkelter." After this quick break, our two resident crime experts will give us their analysis of Episode 9.
Tom, a fascinating episode this week, Episode 9. The control that this guy exerted on people, which is absolutely incredible when you think about it. It brings up lots of issues about the policing at the time, lots of stuff that we spoke about in Crime Time Inc. over the last year or so, and numerous episodes about police procedure and how critical that is, especially at the very start of an inquiry. I'm really looking forward to moving on with this into Episode 10 now. Tom, it was some episode, wasn't it?
It was, Simon. I'll tell you, Alex, I did question, right at the start, I thought the use of gratuitous violence, albeit you'd made all the warnings, was maybe a wee bit over the top. But actually, having listened to the two episodes, I now realise you actually need that to illustrate exactly what happened here. It is remarkable. I thought I knew about the Manson murders, but I didn't. I've found it very interesting indeed. One question though, Alec. The Manson murders are always styled as being serial killings, but from the description you give, they don't sound like serial killings to me, more like spree killings. I remember when I was studying this, there was a clear differentiation between a spree killing or spree killings and serial killings, which are interspersed long distances of time, more than 3 murders. It's an academic point, but I would be interested in what you thought about that, because I remember at the FBI, very keen to make sure that you differentiated between the two kinds of crimes, because they, of course, lead you to investigative priorities, etc. So just a question, but I mean, that's a small matter. Fantastic episode.
Tom, I have an answer for you, but I think we should leave that for later because there are still more murders to come, and I don't want to spoil it for our listeners. But remind me about that question later. Do you agree?
Absolutely. You know what it really has impressed upon me these episodes, and that is the power of the cult. The absolute power of the cult, the power this man exercised over these people, the mind power, the mental supremacy that he must have, the psychological supremacy he must have exercised over these women. And Tex, he's turned these people into cold-blooded killers, people who attack complete strangers. Normally, a murder, it's either rage or jealousy or passion, or in the case of sexually motivated killers, lust. But these people are just going into houses where they don't know who's in the house, they have no connection, and then in absolute cold blood and with no rage, they are attacking them and mutilating them to a great degree. And I think that's extraordinary. It brings home this mental power, this complete domination that Charlie Manson must have had over his gang, over his family.
And it puts into context other people in history, Tom, and possibly in the present day, without naming anyone, who have this hypnotic effect on a mass scale. I'm thinking of Al Capone, I'm thinking of Hitler, people who had effect on society and the world simply because of their oratory powers and the way they could persuade people to do.
Or even, Simon, bringing it up to date, and without mentioning any names, some of the social media influencers who seem to exercise enormous power over the behaviour and mindset of many young people. It's interesting. The comparisons with the great dictators, Hitler and these people, remember that they had massive PR machines behind them. They had very sophisticated PR machines, whereas Charlie Manson's just a dopehead, but he seems to have had this incredible magnetism, this power over these young women who go out in his name in the middle of the night and cold-bloodedly hack people to death. Sharon Tate, you imagine me, just put yourself, let's stop for a second. Sharon Tate is 8 months pregnant, right? 8 months pregnant. And yet these girls attack her and stab her multiple times, including in the stomach area. What? I mean, it's against nature, Simon. It really is against nature.
Yeah.
And the whole motive for carrying out these murders is to somehow muddy the waters in the Beausoleil case, and also to bring on HelterSkelter. And while I can see the logic in the Beausoleil case, if he'd done it properly, because he didn't, because the whole thing was distracted by the fame and the notoriety of Sharon Tate. But in terms of instigating HelterSkelter, I don't see... I would like to have sat down with Charlie Manson and said, Charlie, how did you think this was going to work? He must have thought that the whole race war thing was absolutely on tenterhooks, and it only needed a spark from him to set the whole world ablaze. He must have actually believed that, because he talks about having a retreat area, going back to the desert, going back to the ranch in the middle of nowhere to hide out. And while I can see the Beausoleil plan, I can see the logic of the Beausoleil plan, I just cannot see the HelterSkelter logic. I just don't see the evidence for that at all. And I think this is evidence that Charlie's starting to be a bit deranged. The press was meant to be looking at the motives for the murder, not at the victim.
Tom, you could say all the victims were unlucky, but poor Stephen Parent. Talk about wrong place at the wrong time. A little bit earlier or a little bit later, and we wouldn't be talking about him now as one of the victims.
Absolutely. Trying to sell an alarm clock radio, for goodness sake. Talk about the fickle finger of fate. Quite often when you look at murders and you look at them and you look at the circumstances led up to it, it is a remarkable combination of factors that bring it together, that bring two drunken men on the corner of the street at the same time. Both of them belligerent for different reasons. One of them has a weapon. Words are exchanged, and these people have no connection, never met each other.
Tom, what did you think of the initial police actions at the crime scene?
Oh my God, but 1969, right? You'd think in LA they would be better at it, but quite clearly they weren't. And I don't know if you noticed the hours that went by before a homicide detective was called to the scene.
That's right. It was the afternoon before the CID got involved.
And meanwhile, everybody had been walking all over the locus, you know?
Footprints everywhere.
Footprints everywhere. The press arrive. It's Hollywood, it's celebrity. They're all over the place. In terms of a crime scene, I've no doubt Simon and Strathclyde, you've had worse crime scenes than that. In fact, I know you have, but there's very few, let's be honest.
I think they must have been trained here.
That's an interesting theory, that, Simon. We should explore that.
Poor Mr. Parent had a bad day that day, didn't he? Made a bad choice to do his door-to-door salesman.
And they were trying to sell a $10 alarm radio. Simon, it brought to mind something I've always thought. How often have you been in a murder squad where you say, how did these two people, how did the assailant and the deceased come together? This chance meeting of people from completely different parts of the world. I remember dealing with a murder very early in my career with a man, two men on a bus, not known to each other at all. Both of them had been drinking. One was extremely belligerent. There was a crossword spoken. They got off the bus at the same stop. One was going to catch another bus. The other lived nearby. Another crossword. There was a fight and one of them was dead. Murder, the other one a life sentence. And these two people would never have come together. Completely different worlds. But yet there they were on that bus that night, both with a drink and just that spark. I thought about that, but that poor guy with his pickup truck and trying to sell his clock radio. Wrong place, wrong time.
You say that, Tom, and you and I both know anyone that lives in a city will understand that even body language can trigger these things. The way you look at someone, eye contact. With the wrong person, anything can be a trigger point and can end up with horrific results.
I remember years ago, I did a Home Office research into public violence in Edinburgh. At the time, we were getting a lot of trouble. And I applied for a grant, got this grant, and got a young research assistant. We looked at people who had both been arrested for and were victims of violent crime. We got assistance from the Accident Emergency Unit at the Royal Infirmary. There was two remarkable things came from that. One is the number of people that we knew had been seriously assaulted who never pitched up at hospital, and the number of people who pitched up at hospital with serious injuries who we had never heard of. It was a completely mutually exclusive clientele. But the other thing we looked at was people who were habitually assaulted, people who were habitually victims of crime. I remember going to see this young man, lived in his own in a bedsit, down in Leith Walk. And often, as you know, these things are the difference between the culprit and the injured party or the deceased. It's just a matter of who got the better of the fight on the night. There's not much to draw between them, really. But anyway, I said to this guy, what is it about you that makes you a victim? His attitude, he was naturally a cheeky sort of guy. He couldn't help himself. Yeah. And he just had a look about him. And I thought to myself, I could just imagine you walking into a pub and making some glib remark which you thought was funny, but which everybody else didn't. I said to him, look, if you want to preserve your health, think very much about how you present yourself, because clearly there is something about you that people take offence to.
Or go and take boxing lessons.
Either that or get better at it. Yeah, that's right. The other thing about episode 9 that struck me was this business about what the motivation was with Charlie. What was he trying to do? He was trying to do two things, wasn't he? He was trying to cast doubt on the Beausoleil thing. He was trying to get Bobby Beausoleil out. So he's trying to infer by his other crimes that actually the Beausoleil murder was part of a pattern and it couldn't be Bobby Beausoleil because he's in jail. number one. And number two, he's trying to spark HelterSkelter, the race war, that he'd convinced in his own mind was about to kick off. And all he needed to do was light the blue touch paper and then retire to the ranch in the middle of the desert and watch the whole thing kick off. And then they'd come back and they'd be the survivors. Now, it strikes me that the plan regarding the Bosley killing, okay, it's a wee bit far-fetched, but it has some merit. But the HelterSkelter plan was for the birds. I don't know where he got that from.
He even misunderstood the climate in LA at that time. LA was never going to be the place for something like that to kick off because of segregation. It was never going to happen. And that comes across quite nicely in Alex's research.
Right. And this whole thing about the Black Panthers, this thing he's got about the Black Panthers, how they're coming to get them and they are an army and they're going to do this and they're going to do that. And actually, there's really nothing to suggest the Black Panthers was ever a movement that could ever have been that sort of size of that moment.
Tom, before we move on to episode 10, I'm anxious to get into the story because we're only at the start of it. I thought there might have been a wee lesson for you there as former Deputy Chief Constable, almost the head of 3,500 people. I think there's a danger where people are scared of him, whether it's because he's an absolute nutcase or because of the power that he can wield and the effect he can have on your life and your career. Most of that 3,500 people agree with you all the time. And I think that's a danger you might be suffering from now.
Seriously, I know that's I meant to be an insult, but you're absolutely right. There is a danger when you get to senior rank that you surround yourself with a hall of mirrors, with people who will only say what you want to say. And I have to say, I think that's a danger for a certain president of the United States as we speak now. The old Machiavellian thing is that you exercise power through love or fear. Or both. And of course, that's true. But all my career and up to now, I have always exercised power through charm.
I thought we were being serious for a minute there.
You should have known better than that time, man.
And Tom, I can assure you that you think I'm being insulting. Nothing's further from the truth. It's all said through love.
All right. Yeah, okay. Listen, Simon, you're on video and I can see your nose growing as we speak.
Okay, Tom, brilliant. Let's move on because I'm sure episode 10 is going to give us plenty to mull over as well. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to it.
See you next time, Simon. And thanks for all your compliments. It's heartwarming. It's heartwarming.